The auctioneer brought his gavel down at $85 on a cold, bright Saturday morning in October of 1984, and the biggest man in the lot threw back his head and laughed so loud that two crows lifted out of the maple tree by the fairground fence. The old man who had won the bid did not laugh back. He did not even turn his head. He just lowered his hand from the rail slow the way a man lowers something he does not want to drop, and looked once more at the thing he had bought. A fire-warped commercial floor safe, 420 pounds of buckled steel, a door bowed outward from old heat, green paint scorched down to the bare gray bones of the metal, and a tarnished brass combination dial sitting just slightly crooked on a face that nobody in 3 counties had wanted to touch. The big man in the rust-brown sport coat would call it a boat anchor before the morning was out, and the name would follow the old locksmith through every diner and feed store in Carbon County for the rest of that autumn. What the laughing man did not know, what nobody standing along that chain-link fence knew, was that the burned safe had come out of the cellar of a hotel that had burned to the ground 16 winters before, and that the man who once owned that hotel had locked something inside it on the last night of his life. Something he had carried a secret about for 35 years. A secret that was about to come out of Scotch steel and walk through a small Pennsylvania town like a quiet weather front and change the way 3 different families remembered a dead man. If you have ever watched a patient person get written off by a loud one, if you have ever known a craftsman whose work the world stopped valuing while he kept doing it right anyway, then settle in, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built for. Take a moment now to subscribe and ring the bell, because the people who stay for stories like Walter Hollenbach's are exactly the company we keep here. Now let me take you back to that cold, bright morning in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, when the last locksmith in Carbon County paid $85 for a box that everyone agreed was worth nothing. His name was Walter Hollenbach, but the older men in town had called him Walt since they were all boys together at the St. Bridget Grammar School on Cole Street. He was 72 years old that October, 6 feet on the dot when he stood up straight, which he did less often now, broad through the shoulders the way a man gets from 60 years of leaning into doors that did not want to open. His face was deeply lined and weathered down to a soft brown along the jaw, and his hair was a short silver under a faded brown work cap with a feed mill patch above the brim. He had pale, steady eyes that did not move fast, and gray stubble he forgot for a day at a time, now that his wife Anna was 9 years gone. He wore a dark canvas jacket worn pale at the cuffs, a chambray shirt that had been blue once and was something closer to dove gray now, and under his fingernails was the soft graphite grime of a man who still touched locks for a living. He had buried Anna in the spring of 1975, and he had not remarried, and he had kept the shop because the shop was the last room in the world where he still felt like himself. The town behind him was the kind of town America had stopped noticing. Millbrook sat in a long, shallow valley in the eastern Pennsylvania hills, anthracite country, the old coal patches turning into something quieter every year. The big breaker at number 11 had gone cold in 1962. The rail spur that once ran behind the hotel district had been pulled up for scrap by 1971. Storefronts on Lehigh Avenue went dark one at a time, the way candles go out at the end of a long service. The Woolworth had closed. The Sears catalog desk had closed. The shoe repair, the milliner, the photo studio above the bank, all of them shut up one by one through the 70s, and the men who had owned them either moved south to their sons or stayed and grew quieter in their houses. And the boys who came up after did not learn the hand trades. They drove out to the new chain stores along Route 209 and they bought factory-sealed brass knobs in blister packs, and they did not know what a tension wrench was. And a man who could still listen to a lock was a thing the modern world was politely finishing with. Walt Hollenbach knew all of this. He had not fought it. He had only kept his shop open, and kept his shears oiled, and kept his promises to whichever neighbor still needed a deadbolt rekeyed before the weekend. That morning, the morning of the auction, he had not even meant to go. He had meant to stay in the shop and finish a set of master keys for the Methodist church up on Spring Street. But Otis Kradzinski, who repaired clocks 2 doors down on Cole Street and had been Walt's friend since 1948, had stopped in at 7:30 and stood in the door and said, "Walter, they're selling out the old county equipment lot today. There is a burned safe in the catalog. I thought of you." And Walt had set down his file and looked at his friend a long second and said only a burned safe out of where. And Otis had said, "Out of the cellar of the Pemberton Arms." And Walt had taken his coat off the hook. The Pemberton Arms had been the proudest building in Millbrook once. 4 stories of red brick on the corner of Lehigh and Center, built in 1908 by a brakeman's son named Silas Pemberton, who had clerked, saved, borrowed, and put up the finest small hotel between Scranton and Allentown. For 60 years it had fed traveling salesmen and railroad men and Methodist conferences. Then on the night of the 17th of February in 1969, in a cold so deep the river had frozen across, a furnace flue had cracked in the cellar, and the old building had gone up like a struck match. Silas Pemberton, 76 years old and a widower, had gone back inside after the last guests were out. They found him the next morning in what had been the back office behind the registration desk. The town buried him with a small notice in the Carbon County Record and called him a foolish old man who had run into a fire for a building made of brick and timber. That had been the story for 16 winters. Walt had been at the funeral. He had stood in the back row in a borrowed coat. He had never believed the story. Now Walt stood at the fence behind the old fairgrounds, and they wheeled the safe up on a pallet jack, and he saw it for the first time. The other men kicked the tires of riding mowers and bid up a flatbed trailer and a county snowplow blade. Nobody but Walt walked over to the burned box. He crouched beside it for almost 10 minutes with his reading glasses pushed down his nose, and he put his bare right hand flat on the scorched top of the steel. And he closed his eyes the way a doctor closes his eyes with a stethoscope on a chest. The dial was crooked but turning. He moved it one slow full revolution to the right, and inside the door he felt the wheels still alive in their pack, stiff, sluggish from the heat, but alive. A fire hot enough to warp the door had not been hot enough or had not been long enough to seize the works behind it. To every other man at the auction the safe was a 400-pound piece of ruined steel. To Walt Hollenbach, it was a sealed letter that nobody had been able to read for 16 years. And he had spent his whole working life learning the only language it spoke. The bidding opened at $5 and went nowhere. There were chuckles along the fence. The auctioneer, a tired man in a sheepskin coat, looked out over the crowd and offered it a second time and a third. And only then did Walt raise one finger off the rail and say in a voice that did not carry past the first row 85. The auctioneer looked once at him to be sure he had heard, and then he brought the gavel down, and that was when Cyrus Brennan laughed. Cyrus Brennan ran the biggest estate clearing outfit between Wilkes-Barre and the Lehigh Gap. He was 47 years old, heavy-set in a way that made his suit coat strain at the second button jowls, clean-shaven and pink dark hair slicked flat under a brown felt hat he wore even indoors. He drove a white Cadillac DeVille that he parked angled and important at any curb that would take it. He had been at that auction to buy 2 lots of office furniture out of a defunct accountant's office and a county utility trailer he meant to sell to a contractor in Hazleton by Tuesday. He had glanced at the burned safe and laughed already once that morning, and he laughed again now louder, performing for the men along the fence. $85, Walter. $85 for a junk box that don't even open. Old man, you just bought yourself a boat anchor. There was that pause that happens in small towns when a loud man says a thing in front of a crowd, and the crowd has to decide in half a second whether to laugh along with him. The crowd laughed along. Walt Hollenbach did not. He bent down slow with his hand on his knee the way a man does at 72, and he ran his palm one more time across the scorched top of the safe, and he said quietly to himself, but not so quietly that Otis Kradzinski, standing 2 feet behind him, did not hear it. A lock is not a wall. It is a letter waiting for the right reader. The words came out of him without thought, the way the Lord's Prayer comes out of a man at a graveside. They were not his own words. They were the first words Friedrich Eberle had ever said to him in a back room on Water Street in the spring of 1929, when Walter Hollenbach was 14 years old and had just been apprenticed to the German locksmith, who would teach him everything he would ever know about how to listen. It took 2 younger men and a come-along to load the safe onto the bed of Walt's 1962 Chevrolet half-ton pickup. The truck sat down hard on its old springs. Cyrus watched from the open door of his white Cadillac and shook his head and said something to the man beside him, and the man laughed. Walt tied the safe down with 3 ratchet straps and checked each one twice the way he checked everything twice. And he drove the 4 miles back into Millbrook at 28 miles an hour, with his hazard lights on, because there is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it does not. And Walter Hollenbach had a whole lifetime of it strapped down in the bed of that truck. He backed the truck up to the wide rear door of his shop on Cole Street and walked the safe down 2 planks on a furniture dolly, an inch at a time, sweating in the October cold. By 4 in the afternoon, with the low yellow sun coming in the front window and falling across his workbench, the burned safe stood square in the middle of his workshop floor under the bare bulb. Walt pulled a wooden stool over to it and sat down the way another man might sit down across from an old friend he had not seen in years. He did not turn the dial. He did not even touch the dial. He only looked. He had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do with a lock you mean to open is nothing at all. He was still sitting there at 5:15 when the bell over the front door chimed, and a young woman stepped through it carrying 2 heavy canvas suitcases, and the world he had been holding still around. The burned safe shifted under him in a way he had not seen coming. Her name was Ruth Hollenbach Mercer, and she was 32 years old, and she was his only granddaughter, and he had not seen her in almost 4 years. She had her grandmother, Anna's coloring dark brown hair to her shoulders, hazel eyes that went a little green when she was tired, the same straight set to her mouth that Anna had always had when she was about to say something she had decided was the truth. She wore a long gray wool coat and a knit scarf the color of cranberries and lace-up boots that had walked from the Greyhound station up Lehigh Avenue and around the corner onto Cole Street through the cold dusk. She set the suitcases down inside the front door, and she looked at her grandfather sitting on his stool in front of the burned safe, and the first thing she said was, "Grandpa, what on earth?" He stood up slow. He took his cap off. He said her name once and only once, and the way a man says a name he has not been able to say out loud to anyone for 4 years. Ruthie. She crossed the shop floor in 3 steps and put her face against the canvas of his jacket. and he held her with both hands flat on her back, and neither of them said anything for almost a minute. When she stepped back, her eyes had gone wet, and she wiped them with the heel of her hand and laughed at herself the way her grandmother used to. And she said, "I should have called. I should have written. I am sorry." And he said, "You are here. That is the writing." He poured her coffee from the percolator on the back bench, the cup heavy and chipped along the rim, and she sat on the second stool with her coat still on, and she told him in pieces. She had left her husband in Pittsburgh on Tuesday. She had taught fourth grade at a parochial school on the south side for 7 years, and had loved her classroom, and had not loved her marriage in at least 3 of those. And on Monday evening, her husband had said a thing to her in the kitchen that she was not going to repeat to her grandfather, but that she had decided in the half hour after he said it would be the last thing he ever said to her in that kitchen. She had packed 2 suitcases. She had taken the bus. She had ridden through the dark across the long curve of the state with her forehead against the window. She did not know what she was going to do next. She only knew that the last house in the world that had ever felt safe to her was the apartment above this shop, and that her grandfather still lived there, and that she had nowhere else she wanted to go first. She asked if she could stay a little while, a week, 2, until she could think. He did not answer right away. He set his own coffee down on the bench. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked past her at the burned safe in the middle of the floor, and then back at her. And he said, "You stay as long as you need to stay. The bed in the back room is made. The sheets are clean. There is stew on the stove upstairs from yesterday." He paused, and then he said the way an old man says a thing he has been turning over for a while, "Ruthie, I am glad you came home." She wiped her eyes again. Then she looked for the first time, really looked at the 400-pound piece of scorched ruin sitting in the middle of her grandfather's workshop floor. "Grandpa," she said, "what is that?" He told her plain. He told her where it came from. He told her what he had paid for it. He told her what Cyrus Brennan had said to him at the fence. And Ruth Hollenbach Mercer, who loved her grandfather more than any living person on the earth, looked at the burned safe and then looked back at him and said gently, "Because she was tired, and because she was honest, Grandpa." "Oh, Grandpa, it is time. It is time to sell the shop. The world does not need locksmiths anymore. You know that. You have known it for 10 years. He did not argue with her. He never argued with anyone in his own shop. He only nodded once slow, and he said, "Maybe so, Ruthie, maybe so. But not tonight. Tonight there is stew." Then he reached out one weathered hand and laid his palm one more time on the brass dial of the burned safe, the way a man lays his hand on the shoulder of a friend who has come a long way to see him. And he left it there a moment. And then he turned off the bare bulb and walked his granddaughter up the narrow back stairs to the apartment above the shop, where the lamp by the window was already burning, the way Anna had always left it burning, and where a pot of beef stew was waiting on the back of the stove for whoever the night brought home. By Monday, the story was loose in town. Roy Pickett at the hardware on Lehigh had heard it from his nephew. The nephew had heard it from a man who had been at the auction. By Tuesday, 2 old men who had not set foot in Walt's shop in 3 years came by on thin excuses, a key copied, a padlock looked at, and stood in the doorway just long enough to lean in and see the burned box squatting on the floor under the bare bulb. By Wednesday, Cyrus Brennan had told the story at the counter of the Blue Comet Diner on Center Street 3 different times, and each time the safe had gotten heavier, and the price had gotten higher, and the old locksmith had gotten older. The boat anchor, he called it. Old Walter Hollenbach and his 400-pound boat anchor. The men at the counter laughed because Cyrus laughed. Walt heard about all of it. He answered none of it. He had spent 60 years learning that a thing either opens or it does not, and that the noise a crowd makes about it has nothing to do with which. What he did instead on the Tuesday night after Ruth arrived after the supper dishes were done and Ruth had gone upstairs to lie down in the back bedroom with a book she did not read, was come back down the narrow stairs in his shirt sleeves and pull his wooden stool up to the burned safe one more time. He sat down. He set his reading glasses on the end of his nose. He laid his fingertips on the brass dial, and he closed his eyes. And in the quiet of the empty shop, with the radiator ticking and the street lamp out on Coal Street throwing a thin yellow line across the floorboards, he began gently the long conversation. A quarter turn, a pause, another quarter turn. The wheels inside were stiff with heat-set grease. He stopped. He went to the back bench and brought back a small bottle of penetrating oil and a thin brass straw, and he worked one careful drop down the spindle, and he waited. He turned again. He felt nothing. He waited. He turned again. And on the 14th turn, very faintly less a sound than a change in the air under his fingertip, he felt the first wheel touch. He opened his eyes. He wrote a number on the back of a feed store envelope with the stub of a carpenter's pencil. 31. He breathed out once slow and laid his palm flat on the steel and said quietly to the empty room, "A lock is not a wall, Friedrich. It is a letter. I remember." He was still sitting there when Ruth came halfway down the back stairs in her stockinged feet to ask if he wanted tea, and she stopped on the third step from the bottom because she could see her grandfather from there. And she had never in her life seen him from quite that angle, in quite that light. He was not the lonely old widower she had been carrying around in her head for 4 years. He was not the man whose shop she had told him 2 hours after walking in the door that it was time to close. He was a craftsman. He had his eyes closed. His hand was on a piece of burned steel, as gently as a man takes the hand of a sleeping child. And in the bare bulb light with the radiator ticking and the street lamp coming in the front window, Ruth Hollenbach Mercer understood for the first time as an adult that her grandfather was listening to something the rest of the town had stopped being able to hear 30 years ago. She stepped back up the stairs without a sound. She lay down on the bed in the back room in her stockinged feet in her grandmother's old quilt, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time, and she did not say a word about selling the shop again for the rest of that week. She might have eventually. She might have the following Monday gone back down to the shop in the morning and asked her grandfather gently what he thought he was going to do with a burned box even if it opened. She might have except that on Friday afternoon with the cold rain coming down on Coal Street and the gutter outside the front window running brown with the first dead leaves of the season. The bell over the door chimed for the second time that week, and a small, neat woman of about 64 came in out of the wet with a black umbrella and a brown leather book pressed against her ribs under her coat, and she set the book down on Walt's front counter, and she said very quietly, "Walter Hollenbach, I think I have found something I am supposed to bring to you." Her name was Mary Ellen Garvey. She had been the head librarian at the Millbrook Free Library for 31 years. Before that, in the late summer and fall of 1968, she had worked the front desk at the Pemberton Arms. She was 19 years old that autumn. Silas Pemberton had hired her himself, and she had been the last person on the staff to speak to him in the lobby before she went home at 6 o'clock on the night of February 17, 1969. 4 hours before the furnace cracked. She had never spoken about the hotel in town. There had not been anyone to speak to. But that morning, sorting a donated estate of papers that had been sitting in a back closet of the library for almost a decade, she had opened a brown leather guest services daybook from the autumn of 1968 and the winter of 1969, and on the last filled page, in the careful round handwriting of the night clerk who had died in the fire, she had read a single sentence that had stopped her with her hand on the page. She slid the book across the counter toward Walt now. She turned it to face him. She put her small dry finger on the line. And Walt, with Ruth standing a step behind him at his shoulder, leaned forward and read in faded blue fountain pen ink the last words anyone in Millbrook had written about Silas Pemberton while he was still alive. Mr. P will not sleep tonight. He told me at supper there is something he must lock away before the winter takes him. He would not say what. Walt looked up slowly from the book. Ruth looked at Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen looked at the burned safe in the middle of the workshop floor behind Walt's counter. And out on Cold Street, the cold rain came down on the gutter, and somewhere in the shop, the radiator ticked once, twice, a third time, and nobody in the room said anything at all. Mary Ellen Garvey did not stay long that afternoon. She slid the daybook another inch across the counter toward Walt, the way a person slides a thing they want to be rid of. And she said in the same quiet voice she used at the library reference desk, "I do not know what he meant. I never knew. But I have thought about that sentence for 16 years, and when I read it again this morning, I thought Walter Hollenbach has the safe now. Walter Hollenbach should have the book." She did not sit. She did not take off her gloves. She only nodded once at Ruth, who she had not seen since Ruth was a girl. And she said the strange small thing women of a certain generation say when they cannot find any other words: "I am glad you are home, dear." And then she went back out into the cold rain with her black umbrella, and the bell chimed once behind her, and the shop was quiet again, except for the radiator and the rain. Ruth picked up the leather daybook in both hands as if it might come apart. She read the line again. She read the line above it. The handwriting was a careful round Palmer method script of a kind nobody had taught in any school in Pennsylvania for 40 years. "Grandpa," she said softly, "he told someone. The night before. He told the night clerk there was something he had to lock away." Walt did not answer for a long moment. He stood with one hand still flat on the open page, the other resting on the corner of the counter, and he was looking past the book and past the front window and past the cold rain on Cold Street into a winter 16 years gone. Then he closed the book gently and set it on the shelf above his bench, between a brown and sharp caliper and a coffee can of brass-pinned tumblers, and he said only, "We had better get to work, Ruthie." He went back to the stool. He sat down in front of the burned safe the way he had sat down 2 nights before. But the air in the shop was different now. There was a witness this time. There was a sentence in a daybook above the bench. There was a young woman in stockinged feet pulling a second stool over to sit beside him, with her elbows on her knees and her hazel eyes on the brass dial. He turned off the radio that had not been on. He set his reading glasses on his nose. He laid his fingertips on the brass, and he tried in the way old men try things they have not had to try in a long while to explain. "A safe like this," he said, the dial moving so slowly under his hand that it barely moved at all, "has 3 wheels behind the door. They are stacked one in front of the other on the same spindle. When you turn the dial, the front wheel turns first, and after enough turns it picks up the next, and after enough turns more, that one picks up the third. Each wheel has 1 notch in it. Those notches are called gates. When all three gates line up at the bottom under the lever fence, the lever drops and the bolt is free to throw. That is the lock. That is all the lock is. Three little wheels and three little notches and a fence sitting on top of them waiting to fall. So you turn it, Ruth said. You turn it, he said. But you do not turn it the way the catalog says, because the catalog says you must know the combination. You turn it the way a man turns it who never knew the combination and never will. You let the wheels tell you where they are. He paused. He moved the dial another half number. There is a thing called a contact area, Ruthie. When the lever fence is resting on top of the wheels and you turn the dial slow every time one of the gates comes around under that fence, the fence dips into it just a little. You cannot see it, you cannot hear it most days with these old ears. But you can feel it under your finger on the dial. A change in resistance no thicker than a piece of paper. He looked at her sideways. Most men, he said, could not feel that change with a microscope. Friedrich could feel it with mittens on. Friedrich Eberle, he told her, while his hand kept moving on the brass, had come to Pennsylvania from a town outside Hanover in 1923 with a leather case of locksmithing tools and a wife who died of pneumonia inside of 2 winters. He had set up a shop on Water Street where a dry cleaner now stood, and he had taken on a 14-year-old apprentice in the spring of 1929 because the boy's father, a brakeman on the Lehigh Valley line, had been killed under a coupler that February, and the boy had needed work, and the German had needed company. Friedrich had not taught the boy how to pick locks for the first 11 months. He had taught him how to sit still. He had set the boy on a wooden stool in the back room with a brass tumbler in his hand, and made him hold it and listen to it and turn it and put it down and pick it up and turn it again, until the boy understood without being told that haste was the one tool a locksmith was forbidden to own. A hand in a hurry, Friedrich would say in his slow, careful English, hears nothing. A hand that is patient hears everything. A lock, Walter, is not a wall. It is a letter. The wall has not been built that I cannot get over. But the letter must be read. Ruth was very quiet beside him. The rain on Cole Street had eased to a soft tapping on the front window. Walt's hand had not stopped moving on the dial. Now, he said, his voice gone lower the way a man's voice goes when he is concentrating the trouble with this one. He paused. He moved the dial a half number to the left and stopped. The trouble, Ruthie, is that the fire warped the door. And when a door warps, the spindle binds. And when the spindle binds, every contact I am trying to feel is being smothered under a 1/4 pound of friction that should not be there. He took his hand off the brass. He shook out his fingers. He had been working for almost an hour, and he had not yet confirmed the second wheel. The trouble was not only the spindle. The trouble was his hands. He did not say this out loud, but Ruth saw it. The arthritis in his right thumb joint had been a quiet weather for 10 years, and a loud weather for 3, and the heat-set grease inside the wheel pack was asking him for a pressure on the dial that the joint did not want to give him. Twice that hour his hand cramped and he had to set it down flat on his thigh and wait. Once he tried to turn the dial too fast in frustration and felt the front wheel skip past a contact he had almost had, and he had to start the whole sequence over. He did not curse. He never had. He only set his palm down on his thigh, and he closed his eyes, and he breathed out once through his nose the way a man breathes out who has decided not to lose his temper with a thing that is older and more stubborn than he is. Ruth got up without a word. She went into the small kitchen off the back of the shop and filled the percolator and put it on the burner. While the coffee came up, she found a hot water bottle in the bottom of the storage closet, the one her grandmother had used for back pain in the last winter of her life, and she filled it from the tap. She came back and laid the warm rubber across her grandfather's right hand without asking, and she pressed his fingers gently around it. "The arthritis," she said. "I should have thought of it. Why did you not say?" He looked at her with something between gratitude and embarrassment, and he said, "A man does not say everything he knows about himself, Ruthie, especially not the parts that are running down." The bell over the door chimed at 20 minutes past 10 the next morning, and a thing happened that Walter Hollenbach had not been expecting, and that he would think about in his bed that night for a long while before he slept. Cyrus Brennan came through the door. He was not wearing his brown felt hat. He was carrying it in his hands, turning the brim around through his fingers the way a man does who is about to say a thing he has rehearsed. He looked in the morning light of Cole Street with no audience along any fence smaller than he had looked at the auction. His coat was the same rust-brown coat. His jowls were the same pink, but the laugh was gone out of his face. And what had replaced it was a kind of careful brightness Walt did not entirely trust. "Walter," he said, "Mr. Hollenbach, I have been thinking about Saturday. I have been thinking I owe you an apology for the way I spoke. I was loud. The men were watching. You know how that goes." Walt did not answer. He stood behind the counter with his hands flat on the wood and waited. Cyrus came another step in. He set his hat on the counter as if to demonstrate that he had nothing to hide. Now he said, "I have been thinking about that safe of yours. I have been thinking it might have some collector value. The body, you understand. Pre-war commercial steel. I have a man down in Allentown who buys old hotel pieces for restorations. Bed and breakfast trade. Restaurant decor. He pays well for the look of a thing whether it works or not. I would like to make you an offer." He paused. $500. Cash. Today. I will bring 2 boys with a truck and we will take it off your floor by noon, and you will be free of it. The number sat on the counter between them like a coin somebody had laid down too hard. $500 in October of 1984 was 3 months of rent on the apartment above the shop. It was a new transmission for the half-ton pickup. It was a winter's worth of fuel oil for the building. Cyrus Brennan was a man who did not pay $1 more than he had to for any object on earth, and he had just offered 6 times what Walt had paid 4 days before. Walt understood with the same quiet steadiness he understood everything else that he was being offered $500 not for a piece of pre-war commercial steel, but for whatever was inside it. He did not yet know what was inside it, but he knew now that Cyrus Brennan thought he knew. Walt did not let any of this show on his face. He let the offer sit there a beat. Then he said in the same flat, polite voice he used to tell a customer that a rekey was going to take until Thursday. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Brennan. The safe is not for sale." Cyrus's smile did not slip, but the corners of it changed temperature. "600, he said. It is not for sale. 7. I can go to 7. Walt shook his head once. He said nothing. He laid his right hand flat on the counter where the daybook had sat, and he waited. Cyrus stood there a long moment with his hat in his hands and his mouth a little open, as if he were about to say a different thing. And then he closed his mouth and picked up his hat and put it on his head, and said very quietly now, in a voice that was no longer for any audience, "You are making a mistake, old man." And he went out, and the bell chimed behind him, and the white Cadillac pulled away from the curb. Ruth had been in the back doorway through all of it. She came forward now and stood at the counter and looked at her grandfather. "Grandpa," she said, "what just happened?" Walt was already taking his coat off the hook. "I do not know yet, Ruthie," he said. but I think we need to find out who Cyrus Brennan's grandfather was. She went to the library that afternoon. Mary Ellen Garvey was at the reference desk with her glasses on a chain, and when Ruth said she wanted to look at the Carbon County record for the autumn of 1967, Mary Ellen did not ask why. She only led Ruth to the back room where the bound newspaper volumes sat on green metal shelves, smelling of old paper and dust. And she pulled down the right volume and set it on a long oak table under a gooseneck lamp. And she patted Ruth once on the shoulder. The way a woman pats another woman, she has decided to be on the side of. And she went back to the desk. Ruth read for 2 hours. She found it on a Thursday in October of 1967, 3 columns wide on page 7. Pemberton hotel ownership challenged in county court. The complainant was a man named William Brennan, a contractor out of Jim Thorpe. He had alleged that a parcel of land underneath the western wing of the Pemberton Arms had been deeded improperly to Silas Pemberton in 1908 and properly belonged to the Brennan family by older claim. The case had been argued in November of 1967 and dismissed in January of 1968. The judge had called the Brennan claim in language reprinted by the paper without colorable merit. William Brennan had died of a heart attack in the spring of 1968, 6 months before the fire. The article did not name his son or his grandson, but the photograph above the article showed a heavy-set man at a courthouse step with the face Ruth Hollenbach Mercer recognized immediately. The jowls were younger and the hair was darker, but it was the same face plain as a coin. It was the face of the man who had stood in her grandfather's shop that morning, offering $700 for a burned box. She walked back to Cole Street in the cold dusk with the photograph copied out by hand on a sheet of library paper, folded in her coat pocket. Her grandfather read the page once at the bench under the bare bulb, and he set it down, and he sat very still for almost a minute. Then he said half to her, and half to the radiator and the rain. So that is what Silas knew. He went back into a burning building for a box that proved a man wrong. And the man's grandson has been waiting 16 years to find out what was inside it before anyone else did. The story moved through Millbrook the way these things move through a small town in late autumn, quietly in kitchens over fences at the counter at Pickett's Hardware. Nobody made any public declarations, but by the end of that week, a thing began to happen at Walt's shop that he did not at first understand. On Wednesday morning, a small brown paper sack appeared on the back step tied with twine. Inside was a fresh bottle of 3-in-1 penetrating oil, the good kind, and a folded note in pencil that said, "Only for the box. No signature." On Thursday afternoon, a small jar of homemade horseradish liniment, the kind the Polish grandmothers in the patch towns made for arthritis, appeared on the front counter while Walt was in the back fitting a key. He looked up, and the bell had not chimed, and the jar was simply there. On Friday morning, Otis Kradzinski came over from his clock shop carrying a brass instrument the size of a pencil, a thing he had made himself overnight on his watchmaker's lathe, a stethoscope of a sort with a small brass cone at one end and a soft rubber earpiece at the other. "Walter," he said, "you cannot hear what your hands cannot hear at 72. So now you will hear with this too." He did not stay for thanks. He set the instrument on the bench and went back to his clocks. Mary Ellen Garvey came on Friday afternoon with a thermos of black coffee and a wax paper wrapped piece of her own apple cake and a small green-shaded reading lamp under her arm. She said only, "You will need better light for the late hours, Walter." She plugged it in over the bench. She set the cake down. She left. The Methodist minister's wife sent 2 clean cotton dish rags by way of her son. The man who ran the Sunoco station on the corner of Lehigh and Spring sent a coffee can full of clean, penetrating oil rags he had set aside special. None of them said anything to Walt about the safe. None of them stayed. They came and they went, and by Saturday, Walt's bench was covered in small, quiet kindnesses from people he had repaired locks for over 40 years and forgotten he had repaired. And Ruth stood at the back doorway looking at the bench and felt her eyes fill in a way she did not let her grandfather see. It was the brass listening tube of Otis Kradzinski that gave him the second wheel. He had been working since after supper on Saturday night, with the green-shaded lamp on now over the bench, and the small jar of liniment rubbed into the joints of his right hand, and the new bottle of oil worked carefully down the spindle. He had pressed the small brass cone of Otis's instrument flat against the door of the safe 2 inches below the dial. He had put the rubber earpiece in his right ear, and he had turned the brass dial as slow as the second hand of a clock. And somewhere just past the number 14, faint as the click of a fingernail on a coffee cup 3 rooms away, he heard it. A single soft tick, the lever fence dipping into the gate of the second wheel. He stopped. He breathed once. He wrote the number on the back of the same feed store envelope. 14. He laid his right hand flat on the steel and he said very quietly, "Thank you, Otis. Thank you, Friedrich." He had 2 of the 3 wheels now and the night ahead of him. And a hot water bottle Ruth had refilled twice without being asked. And for the first time since the auction, he allowed himself to think in the privacy of his own chest that the box was going to open after all. He went upstairs at 1:30 in the morning. He left the bare bulb burning over the bench because he meant to come back down at first light. He locked the back door. He did not lock the front because the front door of Walter Hollenbach's shop on Cold Street had not been locked at night since 1953, and because he had decided a long time ago that a town in which he had to lock his own front door was not a town he wanted to live in. He came down the back stairs at 20 minutes past 6 the next morning, in his shirt sleeves with his glasses in his hand, and he stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom, and he did not move for what Ruth, who came down behind him a minute later, would remember as the longest 20 seconds of her grandfather's life. The front door of the shop was standing partway open. The bell had been wedged with a folded matchbook so it would not chime. The green-shaded lamp had been knocked off the back of the bench and lay on the floorboards with the bulb broken. Walter Hollenbach's feed store envelope with the 2 numbers written on the back in carpenter's pencil was gone, and the brass dial of the 400-pound burned safe in the middle of the workshop floor. The dial Walt had turned 10,000 careful quarter inches over 6 nights had been spun, hard, both directions, 3 or 4 full revolutions in each. The kind of spin a man gives a dial when he means to undo every contact a patient hand has ever found and to send the wheels inside back into the random dark where they had sat for 16 years. Ruth made a sound behind him on the stairs that was not quite a word. Walt did not move for another moment. Then he came down the last 2 steps slow, and he crossed the shop floor in his stockinged feet. And he stood in front of the safe, and he laid his right hand on the cold brass dial, the way a man lays his hand on the forehead of someone he loves, who has taken a turn in the night. The arthritis flared once in his thumb. He did not flinch. He stood there with his hand on the dial and his eyes closed. And after a long moment, he opened his eyes and looked at the broken green-shaded lamp on the floorboards, and then up at his granddaughter on the stairs in her grandmother's old quilted robe. And he said very quietly, with no anger in his voice, and something harder than anger underneath the quiet, "We will start again, Ruthie. The wheels are still in there. They have not gone anywhere. We will only have to listen a little longer." But she could see even from the stairs that his right hand on the brass dial was trembling in a way she had never seen it tremble before, and that whatever Cyrus Brennan had come through that unlocked front door to do in the small hours of a Sunday morning, in October of 1984. He had done it well enough that Walter Hollenbach, the last locksmith in Carbon County, did not yet know whether his 72-year-old fingers were going to be able to find those two contacts a second time. He sat down on the wooden stool slowly, the way a man sits down who is not sure yet what his body is going to do, and he laid both hands flat on his thighs, and he looked at the dial for almost a minute without touching it. Ruth came down the rest of the stairs and crossed to the broken lamp and knelt and began to gather the green glass shards into a folded sheet of newspaper without a word, because she had understood in the second she saw his hand on the brass that there was nothing to say yet. Only things to do quietly while he decided what kind of morning this was going to be. Otis Krasinski came in through the back at 7:20 with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He had seen the front bell wedged from across the street when he opened his own shop, and he had not asked any questions before crossing over. He set 1 cup down beside Walt and 1 beside Ruth, and he looked at the dial, and he said, "Only the matchbook is still in the bell, Walter. Whoever did this wanted you to know it was done." Walt nodded once. He had already understood that part. A man who broke in to steal a thing would have taken the safe if he could lift it, and would have left no trace if he could not. A man who broke in to undo 6 nights of patient listening, and who left the matchbook in the bell so the locksmith would see it on the way down the stairs, was sending a message. The message was that the $700 offer had been the last polite hour of this transaction. Otis sat down on the second stool. He did not say what Walt should do. Otis Krasinski had repaired clocks beside Walter Hollenbach for 36 years and had learned in the first year of it that a craftsman in trouble does not want advice. He wants company. So he drank his coffee and he watched, and after a while he picked up the small brass listening tube from where it had rolled under the bench during the night, and he set it carefully back on the green felt pad where it belonged. And he said, "The cone is not bent, Walter. The tube is fine. So begin when you are ready." Walt did not begin that day. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs until the coffee was cold, and then he stood up slow, and he walked across the shop, and he closed the front door, and he turned the deadbolt for the first time in 31 years. The small dry click of his own lock under his own hand was a sound he heard in his chest more than in his ears. He said quietly to Ruth and to Otis, both of them watching him from the bench, "The town has changed enough that the front door will be locked from tonight on." Then he came back to the stool, and he sat down again, and he said, "But the box has not changed. The wheels are still where they were. They have only been turned around. We will find them again." He did not find them that day. He worked from 9 in the morning until almost 4 in the afternoon, and the arthritis in his right thumb went from a weather to a storm, and twice his hand cramped so hard Ruth had to press the joint flat between her own palms and hold it until the cramp let go. He confirmed nothing. The penetrating oil had begun to creep into the wheel pack at last, and the wheels were turning more freely now, which should have been a help, and was instead a different kind of trouble, because every contact he was hunting for was thinner and quieter than it had been before. By 4 o'clock, his shirt was damp at the collar, and his hands were not steady enough to hold the brass cone of the listening tube against the door without it slipping. He set the cone down. He closed his eyes. He said very quietly, "A lock is not a wall, Friedrich. I remember. But the wall has not been built that I cannot get over. And the letter must be read." He opened his eyes. He looked at Ruth, who was standing at the bench mending the wick of the green-shaded lamp Otis had rewired at noon. He said, "Ruthie, come here." She came and stood beside him. He took her right hand in both of his. Her fingers were long and thin with no rings on them anymore, and the small callus from a fountain pen at the inside of her middle finger that her grandmother had had in the same place. He turned her hand over and laid her fingertips flat on the brass dial of the safe. "Walt," she said, "I cannot." He shook his head once. "You can," he said. "You have my mother's hands. She had Friedrich's ear. I do not know if a thing like that passes through 3 generations, Ruthie. But I have nothing else left to try today, and you are here. Sit down. Put the cone against the door. Put the earpiece in. Turn the dial as slow as you can. When you feel a change under your finger, stop and tell me." She sat. She put the earpiece in. She set the cone flat against the steel. She turned the dial. She turned it for almost 20 minutes while her grandfather sat behind her, with his own hand resting lightly on her wrist, not guiding, only feeling the speed of her turn through the bone of her arm, slowing her down with the smallest pressure when she began to hurry. Otis sat across from them and watched and did not say anything. The radiator ticked. The locked front door let in nothing. At 12 minutes past 5, Ruth Hollenbach Mercer stopped the dial halfway between 30 and 31, and she said very quietly, the way a person says a thing, "She is not sure she has the right to say, Grandpa. I think I felt it, a tiny pull, like the dial wanted to dip." He did not move his hand from her wrist. He said, "Slow now. Quarter number to the right." She turned it. "Stop," he said. "Quarter number back to the left." She turned it. "There," she said. "There it is again." He breathed out once long. "Write it down, Otis." He said it without taking his eyes off her hand. Otis wrote 30 on the back of a fresh envelope. They had the first contact again. It had taken her grandfather 6 nights to find it the first time. It had taken her with his hand on her wrist an afternoon. She found the second one at 20 past 9 that night, just below 14, exactly where her grandfather had found it, before Cyrus Brennan came through the door. And when she said the number out loud, Walt set his forehead down for a moment against the cold brass beside her hand, and Ruth understood then in a way she would not have words for until much later that her grandfather had been afraid he was finished, and that her own hands had given him back something the loud man had tried to take. Otis said only 2 down, Walter. Walt lifted his head. He said 1 to go. The third wheel fought them. It fought them through the rest of Sunday and through Monday and into Monday night. The warped door pinched the works in a way that smothered the third contact under everything else, and twice Ruth was sure she had found it and was wrong, and once she almost cried and went out into the back alley alone in her coat for 10 minutes, and came back in with her face cold and her mouth set. Walt did not push her. He did not push himself. He sat beside her on the second stool with his hand resting lightly on her wrist, slowing her down. And at 17 minutes past 1 in the morning of Tuesday, the 23rd of October, with the green shaded lamp burning, and Otis asleep in the chair by the radiator, and the locked front door letting in nothing, the third gate dropped into place under Ruth Hollenbach Mercer's fingertip, with a sigh so small it could only be felt and not heard. She did not speak. She only turned her face to her grandfather. He nodded once. He took the handle in his own right hand. He drew it back. The bolts pulled clear with a long, slow sound, like a man letting out a breath he had been holding since 1969. And the door of the safe that nobody in Carbon County had been able to open for 16 years swung wide on its scorched hinges into the green-shaded light. They did not reach in for a long moment. The air inside the safe smelled of cold metal and old paper, and a faint dry sweetness like the inside of a closed church. There were 3 things in there, set on a folded square of black felt by a hand that had taken care. The first was a leather portfolio cracked along its spine. Inside it, a deed to 14 acres of hardwood on the north ridge above Millbrook, recorded in 1939, paid clear in the name of Silas Pemberton. The second was a small roll of red velvet, and when Walt unrolled it on the bench under the lamp, 32 Liberty Head double eagles from the 1890s lay against the felt in 2 even rows, the gold soft and yellow as a candle flame. Behind them, bundled with a strip of brown paper and a rubber band gone brittle with the years, lay a stack of Lehigh Valley Railroad common stock certificates from 1920, each one stamped and signed and never cashed. The third was a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed but unscorched with one line written across the front in a careful old fountain pen hand. To whoever was patient enough to open this. Walt slit the envelope with the back of a small file. He sat down on the stool. He set his reading glasses on his nose. Ruth stood at his shoulder. Otis had come awake by the radiator and stood now in the doorway with his cap in his hand, the way a man stands at the back of a church for a service he has not been invited to but does not want to leave. The letter was 1 page. It was dated the 16th of February, 1969. The handwriting was the round, careful hand of a man who had taken his time over every word. If you are reading this, Silas Pemberton had written, then you had the patience that no one else in this town has had, and that tells me I can trust you with the rest of what I have to say. The hotel is failing. The new highway has taken the trade. I am old and my wife is 6 years buried, and I will not see another spring. What is in this box is not for the bank, and not for my creditors, and not for any cousin I do not know in Philadelphia. It is for 2 purposes only, and I ask the patient reader of this letter to honor them in the order I write them. Walt paused. He looked up once at Ruth. He read on. The gold and the railroad certificates I leave to the town of Millbrook. Sell them honestly. Spend them on a thing that keeps. A reading room, a clinic, a roof on the library, something that holds. The hotel was mine, but the town was older than the hotel and will be older than my name, and I would like the town to have the better part of what I made under its roof. The 14 acres on the North Ridge are a different matter. They were never mine to give to the town. I bought them in 1939 in my own name, but I bought them for a boy who never knew I was his father. His mother and I were both married to other people. She was the wife of a foreman at the colliery in Lansford. The boy was born in the autumn of 1934. He was raised by her husband as his own, and he was raised well. And I had no right to walk into his life with the confession that would only hurt the people who had loved him properly. So I bought him the 14 acres instead in case the day ever came when a piece of earth might be of use to him. And I put the deed where it could not be taken until someone patient enough to open this box thought it was time. His name is Harold Aldrich. He lives in Scranton. He works at the Erie shops there as a welder. If he is still living when you read this, find him. Bring him this deed. Tell him only that an old man who once owned a hotel in this valley thought of him every Christmas of his life. Do not tell him more than he asks to know. A man's name is not the noise he makes leaving. It is what he troubled to leave behind in the hand of the one person willing to listen for it. Silas Pemberton. Walt read the letter once. He read it a second time. Then he folded it along its old creases and laid it back on the felt. And he took off his reading glasses and he set them on the bench. And he sat for a long time with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes closed. Ruth was crying without sound at his shoulder. Otis had bowed his head in the doorway. Outside on Cole Street, the small hours of a Tuesday morning in October were as quiet as Millbrook ever got. And through the front window, a single yellow street lamp threw its thin line across the floorboards, the way it had thrown its line every night for 40 years. He could have kept it. A widower above a shop the world had finished with could have rolled 32 gold coins into his pocket and walked the rest of the way to his grave. A man no longer worried about a furnace bill, and no one would have known. Walter Hollenbach took the leather portfolio and the red velvet roll and the bundle of railroad certificates and the letter. And at 9:30 that morning, he carried all of it in a flour sack down Lehigh Avenue to the office of the town solicitor. And he set it on the desk and he said only this was Silas Pemberton's. It was never mine. Then he went home and opened the shop at 10 o'clock because a woman on Spring Street needed a deadbolt rekeyed before the weekend, and Walt had told her Tuesday. They went up to Scranton on the Greyhound on Saturday morning, Walt and Ruth together. They found Harold Aldrich at a small frame house on Pittston Avenue, 50 years old. Gray at the temples, a welder's burn scar on the back of his left hand. He took them into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and bacon grease and read the letter standing at the sink with the morning sun on his face. And when he was done, he set it down very gently on the counter and put one hand on the edge of the counter to steady himself. And he said quietly, "My mother never said. She never said one word." Walt did not answer. There was no answer to give. Harold Aldrich turned at last and put his hand flat on Walter Hollenbach's shoulder, the way one working man puts his hand on another, and he said, "Thank you for not giving up on a thing that was meant for me." And Walt only nodded, and the morning went on. Cyrus Brennan's company went under inside 14 months. It was not Walt's doing. Cyrus had overpaid on 3 estates that did not move, and the bank took the white Cadillac in the spring of 1986. And he closed the office on Lehigh and went south to a brother in Maryland, and was not heard from again in Carbon County. But in the last week of October of 1984, 4 days after the safe came open, a plain white envelope appeared in Walt's mailbox with no return address, and inside it lay 4 $20 bills and a 5 in cash with no note. $85 exactly. Walt looked at it for a long time at his bench under the green-shaded lamp, and then he folded the bills and put them in the cigar box where he kept the petty cash. And he did not tell Ruth, and he did not tell Otis, and he did not tell anyone in Millbrook then or after. Because a man does not need to say everything he knows about another man, especially the small late parts that are reaching for the light. The Pemberton reading room opened on the 2nd floor of the Millbrook Free Library in the spring of 1985. It was not a large room. It had a stone fireplace from the old hotel that the demolition crew had set aside for a use nobody had imagined yet, and 4 leather chairs and a long oak table under a green-shaded lamp very much like the one on Walt's bench, and shelves of donated books along 3 walls. In the corner by the window that looked out onto Lehigh Avenue stood the 400-pound burned safe with its coach door propped open, and its brass dial polished soft, and a small brass plate on the wall beside it that said in plain block letters, "What is locked is not always lost." Mary Ellen Garvey ran the room on Tuesdays and Thursdays and every other Saturday. Ruth Hollenbach of Mercer did not go back to Pittsburgh. She took a teaching position at the Millbrook Elementary School in January, and in the evenings after she had washed the supper dishes in the apartment above the shop, she came down the back stairs and sat on the 2nd stool at her grandfather's bench, and learned slowly the way her grandfather had learned slowly in 1929, how to cut a key by hand on a number 4 file and how to set the pins on a 5-tumbler deadbolt, and how to put her fingertips on a dial and close her eyes and wait. He did not push her. He never had. He only said on the first evening the same thing Friedrich Eberle had said to him on a backroom stool in the spring of 1929. A hand in a hurry hears nothing, Ruthie. A hand that is patient hears everything. The lock is not a wall. It is a letter. He did not have to say it twice. On an afternoon in early September of 1985, with the maple at the corner of Lehigh and Center beginning to turn at its highest leaves, Walter Hollenbach walked the 4 blocks from his shop on Cole Street up to the library with his brown work cap in his hands. He stood on the sidewalk in the warm slanted light and looked through the tall second-floor window of the reading room. Inside, 3 small children were standing in front of the burned safe with their mother. One of them, a boy of about 6, had reached up on his tiptoes and put his small hand flat on the scorched top of the steel, in the same place Walt had put his own hand at a chain-link fence on a cold, bright morning the autumn before. The boy's mother was bending down to tell him what it was. Walt could not hear the words through the glass. He did not need to. He stood there a minute longer in the soft September light, with the smell of wood smoke from somebody's first stove of the season just beginning to come down Lehigh Avenue, and with the late sound of swallows working the eaves above the library doors. And he put his cap back on his head, and he turned and he walked home along the sidewalks of the town that had finally heard, after 16 winters, what a quiet man had once tried to leave behind in a burned box for the patient reader who came along in his own good time. A safe only ever keeps what someone trusted it to hold. The hard part was never the lock. So I leave the question with you the way Walter Hollenbach left it with his town. If you had crouched at that fence on that cold, bright morning and felt those wheels still turning inside the ruin, would you have paid the $85 and trusted a dead man's burned box to be worth your patience? Or would you have laughed along with the loud man in the good coat and walked away with the crowd? Tell me gently in the comments. And if Walter's story stayed with you tonight, take a moment to subscribe to Iron Hook Stories, because the next quiet life we sit beside is already waiting on the bench under the lamp.